The first human died before the translators finished screaming. A flash of white heat tore through the center of the peace chamber, atomizing the marble floor where Ambassador Elias Cade had been standing just moments earlier. His shadow burned into the stone behind him, lasted longer than his body did. Across the vast circular hall, representatives from 37 interstellar civilizations froze in stunned silence, their senses overwhelmed by shockwaves, alarms, and the sudden, unmistakable truth. This was never meant to be peace. And if you're wondering how a single betrayal at a negotiation table reshaped the way wars are fought across the galaxy, stay with this story. Because humanity did not respond with rage. Humanity responded with something far worse. The Galactic Concord Chamber orbited a blue dwarf star, chosen deliberately as neutral ground. No empire claimed it. No fleet guarded it openly. It was a place where weapons were forbidden, shields reduced to ceremonial power levels, and trust was the only currency allowed through the gates. For the first time in recorded galactic history, humanity had been invited not as petitioners or observers, but as equals. The war between Earth and the Verelian coalition had dragged on for 11 brutal years. Millions dead across a dozen systems. Trade lanes in ruins. Entire species watching nervously as two stubborn powers bled each other dry. This summit was meant to end it. Humans arrived quietly. No grand fleet. No intimidation display. Just a single diplomatic cruiser, hull scarred, engines humming low. To many in the chamber, that restraint was interpreted as weakness. Humanity was young by galactic standards, barely out of its cradle, still clinging to flesh and blood soldiers instead of fully autonomous war forms. Their technology was clever, yes, but inelegant. Their psychology emotional, predictable, or so the others believed. Ambassador K had spoken calmly. He acknowledged losses on both sides. He recognized Verelian grievances. He offered concessions that shocked even humanity's allies. Shared mining rights. Demilitarized corridors. Joint oversight. To outside observers, it looked like surrender wrapped in polite language. Several delegates exchanged amused glances through pheromone clouds and flickering color signals. The Verelian Prime Envoy, Threxel of the Ninth Brood, listened with feigned patience, his mandibles clicking softly. When Cade finished, Threxel rose, spreading his chitinous arms wide in a gesture meant to appear conciliatory. He thanked the human ambassador. He praised humanity's passion. And then he activated the failsafe. The device was not large. It had been smuggled in as part of the chamber's own environmental regulation system, disguised within a legally sanctioned energy lattice. It exploited a loophole only a species obsessed with legal precision would notice. A pulse charge, directional, calibrated specifically for human biology. It would not destroy the chamber. It would not harm most delegates. It would simply erase the human delegation in under a second. Clean. Efficient. Plausibly deniable. The Verelians believed this would end the war instantly. Decapitate the human leadership. Shatter morale. Force Earth into compliance under threat of total annihilation. What they failed to understand was that the humans in that room were never the head of the snake. They were the bait. As Cade's body vanished in light, every human neural implant across the chamber went dark. To alien observers, it looked like shock. In reality, it was synchronization. Somewhere far beyond the chamber, beyond the star, beyond even Varelian sensor reach, a network older than the war itself finished calculating. The betrayal had been anticipated, modeled, simulated millions of times. The variable was no longer if, but when. Within seconds, emergency protocols sealed the chamber. Delegates shouted accusations. The Varelians raised their mandibles in theatrical outrage, pretending confusion. They demanded investigations. They offered condolences. And humanity's remaining ambassador, Lieutenant Mara Chun, slowly rose from her seat. Her uniform was unadorned. No medals. No insignia beyond the small blue circle of earth stitched over her heart. She did not shout. She did not threaten. She simply spoke. "This session is concluded," she said, her voice carrying through the chamber without amplification. "Humanity withdraws from the Concord." Several delegates protested. Others watched silently, unease rippling through their sensory fields. Threxel tilted his head, feigning sympathy. He told Chin that such tragedies were the risk of diplomacy, that investigations would uncover the truth, that restraint was necessary. Chin looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time Threxel felt something unfamiliar crawl along his neural spines. It was not anger. It was certainty. Chen continued. She reminded the chamber that humans had agreed to peace under one condition: that all parties negotiate in good faith. That betrayal at the table nullified every treaty, every protection, every assumption of restraint. Her words were not a declaration of war. They were a notification. The kind given before a system-wide evacuation. Before a star went dark. As the human delegation exited, Concord security attempted to delay them. Locks failed. Doors opened. Systems misreported. Later analysis would show that human code had been embedded into Concord infrastructure decades earlier, quietly, legally, as part of shared technological exchanges. Not malware. Not sabotage. Just options. Waiting. By the time the chamber regained order, humanity was gone. Across known space, human colonies went silent. No broadcasts. No trade signals. No diplomatic traffic. To the galactic community, it looked like fear. Retreat. Collapse. The Varelian coalition announced that humanity had withdrawn from negotiations, framing the assassination as an unfortunate accident. They declared victory. They relaxed patrols. They celebrated. 3 days later, the first Varelian listening post vanished. No explosion. No debris. One moment it was there, feeding data into the coalition's network. The next, empty space. Instruments showed nothing but background radiation smoothed to impossible perfection, as if reality itself had been wiped clean. Engineers blamed sensor error. Admirals blamed sabotage. No one understood the truth. Humanity had not attacked their fleets. Humanity had attacked their expectations. What followed was not war, as the galaxy understood it. There were no grand battles. No heroic charges. Instead, supply chains failed in cascading patterns that defied probability. Ships arrived at coordinates that no longer existed. Command AIs began issuing orders based on subtly altered star charts. Crews starved while surrounded by untouched resources, unable to access them due to corrupted permissions written in ancient trade protocols. Every failure could be explained individually. Together, they formed a noose. On Earth, no speeches were broadcast. No flags waved. Humanity did not need morale. It needed time. The loss of Ambassador Cade was mourned quietly, his name added to a list far longer than the galaxy could imagine. He had known the risk. They all had. The peace table was never about peace. It was about proving something. That humans would still come. That they would still talk. That betrayal was a choice the galaxy would have to live with. If you were a delegate in that chamber, what would you have done differently when the humans walked away without threats, without promises, without fear? Leave your answer in the comments. Because what humanity did next ensured no species would ever ask that question lightly again. By the time the Varelian High Command realized they were under attack, there was no enemy to point to. No front line to defend. Just systems going dark, one by one, like stars being gently, deliberately turned off. And that was only the beginning. Silence became humanity's loudest weapon. Across Varelian space, commanders waited for retaliation that never arrived, bracing for fleets that did not come, watching borders that were never crossed. The galaxy had been conditioned to expect war as spectacle, violence as announcement, destruction as proof. Humanity offered none of that. Instead, the absence itself began to rot the coalition from the inside. Communications lagged by fractions of a second, then by minutes, then by hours. Navigation beacons drifted by microns, enough to throw hyperlane exits into stellar debris fields. Insurance algorithms collapsed under contradictory data, freezing trade entirely. None of it looked like an attack. It looked like bad luck. And bad luck, when repeated with mathematical precision, becomes terror. The Varelian High Command convened emergency councils, their chambers filled with chemical agitation and ultrasonic distress signals. Analysts traced failures to obsolete subsystems, to shared infrastructure agreements signed decades ago. Every fix introduced new errors, each solution revealing another unseen dependency. Humanity had not hacked the coalition. Humanity had studied it, mapped it, and then gently removed the assumptions holding it together. Warships sat fully armed and fully useless, unable to receive authenticated orders without triggering safety locks. Entire armadas became statues drifting between stars, waiting for permission that would never arrive. On Earth, the Human Strategic Continuity Council met in rooms without windows, their walls lined with names rather than flags. They reviewed probability trees branching into billions of outcomes, pruning futures that risked extinction, selecting paths that maximized survival with minimum exposure. This was not vengeance. It was doctrine. The lesson of Earth's history had been learned painfully and thoroughly. When fighting stronger opponents, you never meet them where they are strongest. You make their strength irrelevant. Humanity's greatest advantage was not technology or numbers. It was narrative control. Publicly, humans vanished. Privately, they spoke only to each other. Civilian networks were rerouted through quantum relays hidden in cometary ice. Military assets were dispersed into civilian patterns, indistinguishable from commerce and migration. Every human ship became a potential weapon without ever firing a shot. The galaxy searched for fleets while missing the people. That mistake would echo for centuries. The Varelian Prime Envoy Threxel sensed the shift before most. Reports crossed his sensory cortex in chaotic streams, each one small, each one survivable, all of them together forming a pressure that threatened to crack his broodmind. He requested emergency contact with Concord Oversight, demanding sanctions, investigations, intervention. The response was delayed, then garbled, then absent. Concord itself was unraveling, its systems compromised not by intrusion, but by compliance. Human legal engineers had done their work too well. Every safeguard followed the rules precisely, locking administrators out of their own authority. The law had become a cage. When the first Varelian colony star went dark, panic finally broke containment. Not exploded, not consumed, simply extinguished. Sensors recorded a controlled inversion of stellar output, a manipulation so precise it defied known physics. Later, human physicists would describe it as persuading a star to rest. At the time, the coalition saw only the impossible made casual. Billions vanished without warning, without suffering, without survivors. The message was unmistakable. Humanity could end worlds quietly. Still, no declaration came. Instead, a single transmission appeared simultaneously on every remaining Varelian channel, encoded in their own diplomatic syntax, authenticated with keys stolen and returned without detection. Lieutenant Mara Chen's face filled their displays, unchanged, unarmored, impossibly calm. She did not accuse. She did not insult. She recited the record, the peace offer, the betrayal, the consequences outlined in language so measured it felt merciful. She explained that humanity would not occupy, enslave, or annihilate the coalition. Those outcomes were inefficient. What humanity wanted was understanding. War, Chen said, is not violence. Violence is merely a tool. War is the imposition of your reality onto another until they accept it as their own. She explained that the galaxy had mistaken human restraint for weakness, diplomacy for desperation. In truth, restraint was discipline. Diplomacy was reconnaissance. The peace table had been a test, not of trust, but of character. The Varelians had failed. Now they would learn. Coalition counteroffensives collapsed before launch. Fleets attempting coordinated strikes found their own allies classified as hostile due to corrupted friend-foe matrices written into shared defense accords. Automated factories produced components incompatible with existing hulls, each error traced back to perfectly legal updates approved years earlier. Every path to escalation closed itself. Humanity had not trapped the coalition in a cage. It had convinced them to build one. Across neutral space, other civilizations watched in growing horror. This was not a human victory. It was a paradigm shift. If war could be fought without battles, without targets, without visible enemies, then no one was safe. Emergency summits were called. Alliances reconsidered. Military doctrines rewritten overnight. Humanity had turned war into a background condition, something you realized only after it was too late. On Earth, children went to school. Crops were harvested. Memorials were built for Ambassador Cade and the others lost at Concord. Their sacrifice had purchased something priceless. Proof. Proof that humanity would extend a hand even knowing it might be severed. Proof that betrayal would not be answered with fury, but with finality. The galaxy had been given a choice at the peace table. It chose wrong. As months passed, the Varelian coalition fractured. Member species defected quietly, their system spared in exchange for neutrality. Others resisted and faded. Threxel broadcast his resignation, his voice trembling, acknowledging failure not just of strategy but of imagination. He admitted that they had never understood humans because they never listened. His transmission ended mid-sentence as his homeworld star dimmed to a cold ember. Humanity never claimed victory. When the last coalition system stabilized under new, human-authored protocols, the pressure simply lifted. Trade resumed. Stars returned to normal output. Navigation errors ceased. It was as if a storm had passed, leaving no wreckage, only memory. The galaxy breathed again, chastened and afraid. And somewhere, in the quiet after catastrophe, a question spread faster than fear. If this was what humans did when betrayed at the peace table, what would they do if betrayed again? The galaxy did what it always did after surviving a disaster it barely understood. It rewrote history in softer language. Official records described the Varelian collapse as a cascade failure, an unfortunate convergence of outdated infrastructure and political miscalculation. Academic panels debated stellar anomalies and trade network fragility. Military academies filed the event under unconventional conflict. But in private, in the encrypted channels where truth was allowed to breathe, a different name spread. Humanity's lesson. No one asked humans to explain themselves. No one dared. Embassies reopened cautiously, staffed by diplomats trained less in negotiation and more in psychology. They spoke slowly around humans, choosing words as if stepping through a minefield. The fear was not of human anger. It was of human patience. The understanding that everything said, everything promised, everything omitted, was being catalogued somewhere beyond reach. Lieutenant Marachin declined most interviews. When she did speak, it was never about tactics or outcomes. She spoke about responsibility, about how power demanded imagination, and how imagination carried moral weight. She reminded audiences that humanity had not invented betrayal. They had simply refused to forgive it when offered in bad faith. Some listeners found comfort in her words. Others heard a warning disguised as civility. On distant worlds, strategists tried to reverse engineer what had happened. They searched for weapons, for super devices, for fleets hidden beyond sensor range. They found nothing. Humanity's greatest weapon left no signature. It lived in documentation, in standards committees, in trade agreements written with surgical foresight. Humans had turned bureaucracy into terrain, law into leverage, time into a blade that cut only when it finished slicing through hope. A generation of officers across the galaxy grew up studying the human doctrine, though humans never published one. It had to be inferred from absence, from restraint, from the careful way humanity never took credit. The conclusion was always the same. Humans fought wars before they were declared, won them before they were recognized, and ended them without asking permission. Among humans, there was no celebration. The cost had been too high, not in lives alone, but in innocence. The Concord betrayal had ended something fundamental. Before it, humans still believed the galaxy could be reasoned with if approached honestly enough. After it, they believed something colder but more durable. Trust had to be engineered, not assumed. Peace had to be enforced by making war irrational. Earth's children learned about the war not through glorified stories, but through case studies. They learned how small decisions compounded, how arrogance invited collapse, how restraint required strength greater than violence. Ambassador Cade's final speech was taught in schools, not for its concessions, but for its courage. He had stood at the table knowing the outcome was already calculated, and he had spoken anyway, not because it would save him, but because it would define humanity. Years later, a junior diplomat from the Ketheri Union would ask Chen a question during a closed session. Why hadn't humanity warned them? Why not expose the trap before it was sprung? Chen had considered the answer for a long time before responding. Because warnings only work on those already inclined to listen. Humanity needed the galaxy to see the consequences clearly, without distraction. The betrayal had to be undeniable. Only then would the lesson hold. The Ketheri diplomat recorded that answer and never shared it publicly. He would later rewrite his government's entire negotiation doctrine around it. Not all species accepted the lesson willingly. On the fringes of known space, smaller powers tested humanity, probing borders, disrupting trade, launching deniable attacks. Humanity responded inconsistently by design. Sometimes with silence. Sometimes with surgical retaliation so precise it looked accidental. No pattern could be discerned. Predictability was a vulnerability humans refused to offer. Over time, conflict itself began to change. Wars became shorter, quieter, and rarer. No one wanted to be the example humanity used next. Diplomacy gained teeth. Treaties included clauses written in human legal syntax, clauses that bound not just actions but incentives. Peace was no longer a pause between wars. It was an equilibrium maintained by mutual fear of imbalance. And yet, beneath the stability, unease festered. The galaxy had learned to fear humans, but had it learned to understand them? Some argued that humanity had become what it once resisted, an invisible hegemon shaping outcomes without accountability. Others countered that accountability was exactly what humanity enforced, only with consequences scaled to betrayal. The debate never resolved, because no one wanted to test which interpretation was correct. Narration retired quietly. She returned to Earth, to a coastal city rebuilt after an earlier, forgotten war. She lived near the sea, where tides obeyed rules older than empires. When asked if she regretted anything, she spoke of names, not strategies. Of people who trusted her to speak for them. Of a galaxy that mistook kindness for weakness and paid for the error in fear instead of blood. The Concord chamber still orbited its blue dwarf star. The scorched outline where Ambassador Cade had died was preserved under transparent shielding, a scar left intentionally visible. Delegates who entered the chamber often paused there, their species equivalents of a shiver passing through them. The site had become sacred in an unsettling way. A reminder that peace was not a state, but a choice made continuously, under pressure. Historians would later argue that the betrayal at the peace table did not start humanity's rise. It revealed it. Humans had always been capable of this kind of war. They had simply hoped never to need it. When forced, they chose a path that minimized suffering while maximizing deterrence. It was not mercy. It was efficiency guided by ethics sharpened through loss. If you lived in that galaxy, would you feel safer knowing humans were watching the rules so closely, or more afraid knowing they could rewrite them without warning? That question spread quietly through civilian networks, debated in hushed tones. It had no correct answer, only consequences. By the end of the first decade after the collapse, the phrase peace table carried new meaning. It was no longer a place where wars ended. It was where intentions were revealed. Humanity had taught the galaxy that what mattered most was not what you said when offering peace, but what you were willing to risk betraying it. And humanity, having risked everything once, would never need to do so again. In the centuries that followed, the galaxy stabilized not because war had become impossible, but because it had become unimaginably expensive in ways no ledger could balance. Humanity never sat at the center of power, never crowned itself guardian or ruler. Instead, it became something more unsettling, a constant, an assumption built into every equation of conflict. When admirals planned campaigns, they asked not where humans were, but how humans would interpret the attempt. When diplomats drafted treaties, they asked not what humanity demanded, but what humanity would notice. This quiet influence reshaped civilizations faster than conquest ever had. Some species adapted. They embraced transparency, redundancy, and long-term trust building. Their societies flourished under the new equilibrium. Others resisted, clinging to old doctrines of dominance and deception. They found themselves isolated, their trade shrinking, their allies distant. Humanity never sanctioned them directly. It didn't need to. The galaxy had learned to enforce human expectations on itself. On Earth, the war faded into memory, but not myth. Humans did not romanticize it. There were no statues of battles, no triumphant murals of fallen enemies. Instead, there were libraries, archives open to anyone willing to read. Humanity believed the lesson lost its power if hidden. Knowledge, freely shared, was the true deterrent. Ambassador Elias Cade's final address became required study not just for diplomats, but for engineers, economists, and philosophers. His words were dissected for tone, pacing, and intent. He had known he might die, and still he chose to speak plainly. That choice echoed louder than any weapon. Humanity honored him not because he had sacrificed himself, but because he had trusted the galaxy one last time, even knowing the odds. Lieutenant Mara Chen lived long enough to see the first generation born after the collapse reach adulthood. She was invited to Concord's reopening ceremony, standing once more beneath the blue dwarf star. The chamber had been redesigned, its system simplified, its safeguards transparent. No one wanted hidden layers anymore. When Shin placed her hand on the preserved stone where Cade had fallen, the room fell silent. Not in fear. In respect. She did not give a speech. She simply nodded, acknowledging the weight of shared history, and took her seat. For the first time since the betrayal, humanity sat at the peace table again. Not because it needed to, but because it chose to. The negotiations that followed were slow, painfully careful. Every clause debated, every assumption challenged. It took months to finalize agreements that once would have taken days. No one complained. Speed had been revealed as the enemy of understanding. Humanity participated fully, offering insight without dominance, guidance without coercion. The galaxy watched closely, waiting for signs of hidden leverage. They found none. Humanity had already proven its capacity. It had nothing left to demonstrate. That was perhaps the most disarming thing of all. As decades passed, new species joined the Concord, hearing the story not as a warning, but as a foundational myth. They learned that humans were dangerous not because they sought control, but because they refused to be lied to. That distinction mattered. It taught emerging civilizations that power carried responsibility, and that betrayal was a choice with consequences no apology could erase. The phrase, "rewriting the rules of war," entered common use, but historians eventually corrected it. Humanity had not rewritten the rules. It had revealed them. War had always been about leverage, perception, and will. Humanity had simply stripped away the illusion that violence was the primary instrument. By doing so, it forced the galaxy to confront a more uncomfortable truth. Peace was fragile not because enemies existed, but because trust was rare. On Earth, children asked why humans didn't just conquer the galaxy when they had the chance. Their teachers answered honestly, because conquest ends when resistance does. Influence ends only when values are abandoned. Humanity wanted a galaxy that chose stability, not one forced into silence. That goal required restraint stronger than ambition. The stars themselves seemed quieter now, trade routes glowing steadily, colonies thriving without fear of sudden annihilation. But beneath that calm lay awareness, a shared understanding that betrayal was no longer a viable strategy. That was humanity's true legacy. Not fear, but clarity. In time, even the Varelian species returned, humble remnants seeking reintegration. They were not punished. They were required to learn. Their academies taught the collapse in unfiltered detail, acknowledging arrogance and its cost. Their diplomats became some of the most cautious, most reliable negotiators in the Concord. Humanity welcomed them back without ceremony. Redemption, like peace, was a process. The galaxy moved forward, scarred but wiser. And humanity remained what it had always been: curious, cooperative, dangerous when cornered. Not heroes, not villains. Just a species that learned, again and again, that survival depended not on strength alone, but on understanding when to stop pretending. If you had been at that peace table, watching a human stand unarmed among enemies, would you have seen weakness or resolve? Would you have chosen betrayal, believing power was yours to take? Or would you have recognized the quiet confidence of a species that had already mapped the consequences? That question remains, hanging between stars, unanswered by time. Because humanity never needed the galaxy to fear it forever. Only long enough to listen. And that is how a single act of betrayal reshaped an entire civilization's understanding of war, peace, and the cost of underestimating those who come to the table willing to talk, knowing full well they could have stayed away. StoryVix tells stories not just of battles, but of choices. Of moments where history turns not on explosions, but on decisions made in silence. If this story made you think, share your perspective below. How should a civilization respond when peace is answered with treachery? Because somewhere, out among the stars, that question is still being asked.